the Fourth Plinth in Trafalgar Square. It's a very big issue in the capital. People go on about this incessantly. Largely, that Fourth Plinth was left vacant, and the plan has always been, at some point, that would be a permanent fixture. But before then, there have just been a dozen or plus more temporary statues. Some of them absolutely dire, totally unfitting for this most beautiful square in our capital city underneath Nelson's column. But the latest statue has been unveiled yesterday in the historic square, and this time it's not a monument, of course, to a war hero or a king or maybe even our recent late Queen. Instead, it's a larger-than-life statue of Malawian Baptist preacher John Chilembwe. He fought against British colonial rule. Yes, of course he did. The sculpture, named Antelope, is the newest at Fourth Plinth. Basically, since 2003, we have seen this changing all the time. Andre Walker, before we get to my guest on this, yet again, we're having a kind of a woke statue. We've had a lot of this. We've had all these sort of statues torn down if they're to former slave traders. This is a statue. I don't know what this has got. I don't even know what this has got to do with London or Britain or Trafalgar Square. This is a Pan-Africanist, never heard of him, John Chilembwe, fighting against British colonial rule.
Well, I used to work at London City Hall, and I can tell you for a fact the reason why this Fourth Plinth has had all these temporary installations is it had been reserved for Her Majesty the Queen.
The plan was that after she died, that
was her plan. Now, unfortunately, Trafalgar Square is no longer owned by the Ministry of Defence. It's now owned by the Greater London Authority. So Sadiq can cancel the plan. But let me tell you something. He's not denying the statue going on there. He's changed the policy in order to deny Her Majesty going on the statue, on the plinth.
I mean, a statue of the Queen wouldn't go on yet. I mean, no. These will take, months and months to commission and years to be done. But, I mean, this new statue is actually, I think it's a very beautiful statue. We're showing some of the images. It's actually really, I mean, it's much better than the last one, the ice cream with the cherry on it, for God's sake. But, this again, it's about making a sort of a cultural statement, isn't it? He's one of the first Africans to fight against colonial injustices in the 20th century. He staged an uprising against the British in Malawi in 1915, and he's considered to be very, very influential in terms of black liberation. But again, also some people forget he did once call for every European man to be killed.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
big racist.
Well, I just... Why? I just asked the question, why? Well, let's talk to Sinead Rose. She is a diversity, equity and inclusion strategist and founder of the charity We Are We, a charity aiming to break down the structures and biases that negatively affect and hold women back in today's society. Sinead, we don't have time for an interview now. We've just done the job title. Good morning to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Julia.
Right. What is a diversity, equity and inclusion strategist? Is that about having statues to anti-colonialists in Trafalgar Square?
Well, my role goes beyond that, right? It's about having conversations like this around educating and changing the narrative when it comes to equity, inclusion and equality for all, right? This statue really signifies that. It's a great step forward in terms of changing the narrative. Britain was once a colonizing power.
No, was it? I didn't know that. Did that come up in anyone else's history lessons?
It did not. The narrative...
it did not? What school did you go to, Sinead?
I actually went to a school in Putney.
And they didn't mention at all that we had a British Empire at any point? You want to sue your teachers.
We mentioned it. However, it was definitely, a different narrative in terms of, the impact that the colony actually made on those communities in which, we extorted and the communities in which, were disadvantaged, right, and discriminated against. So this statue really is a change for us in that it really is changing the narrative. When we think about statues are actually there to spark dialogue, right? It's that mirroring between the past and the present. So this is actually a very relevant time for us to have this conversation.
Well, you say it's relevant, but that's because everyone's constantly now talking about just how awful Britain is, and we're responsible for all the evils of the world because we had an empire. An awful lot of other civilizations have had empires, and they have all, without exception, done really bad things. Do you know how we know this? Because pretty much until about 100 years ago, even I would say 70 years ago, pretty much every country did pretty horrible things to most of the people in their country, let alone people in other countries. Empires were brutal. Life, as Hobbes said, nasty, brutish and short. Britain was no different, apart from the fact that Britain was, for instance, the first country, the first civilization and empire to end slavery. under its rule. I mean, that is quite something to be rather proud of. I've been to many countries around the world. As a general rule, countries that have been ruled by the British, who, yeah, absolutely, of course, they exploited. That was the point of those empires. Most of them have done darn sight better than countries that were colonised by other countries.
I would actually beg to differ in that, yes, there might be a change, right, in the history or the way in which we have overtly impacted communities, but it's also about, you know, stepping up and addressing the impact, right? There is a lot.
Why do we need to address the impact? These things happened hundreds of years ago.
It's not just about what happened 100 of years ago. It's about what we are seeing today, right? These things show in different ways, and especially with this statue, if we actually think about this hero, this anti-colonialist hero, who actually was there to fight for the rights, right, of his community, it still is happening today, as we can see with Black Lives Matter protests.
Oh, give me a break. Are you comparing Black Lives Matter with Malawians trying to fight for their independence and freedom?
Definitely. If we actually think about the fact of the significance of the statue, right? John, the hero, is wearing a hat, right? That hat is an act of protest back in that time where he was told that he was not equal to the white supremacists.
Black Malawians were not allowed to wear their hats in front of white collars. Yeah, because it was a nasty, racist, horrible time, as most of life for human beings has been for pretty much all of history until only recent decades. Why don't we celebrate how bloody wonderful it is to be in a nicer, happier, better, more equal world than it is, rather than continually harping back about wasn't the world horrible before now?
Julia, in order for us to celebrate, we must recognise, we must acknowledge, we must be able to have these difficult conversations.
I don't find it a difficult conversation.
It seems to be a difficult conversation for many. The fact that I've been able to, you know, talk to various individuals on board, this tends to be a challenge when it comes about talking about race, when it comes about talking about colonialism, discrimination, microaggressions. There are so many.
Oh, don't at 8:54 get me onto microaggressions, because we haven't got time, and I can use up the rest of the show on that nonsense. But look, this is the thing. I actually think it's a really nice piece of art. The last one was just dire, so I actually think it's actually an appropriate, beautiful piece of art. That it's sparking a conversation. But why is the conversation now always about what a terrible, terrible country Britain has been, and by some extension seems to be the view, and it is now, and it is still a terrible country? It isn't. It's a wonderful country. It's one of the greatest places on earth to live, because we have got such a wonderful track record on integration and race and all of that. So why are we constantly criticising this country?
Because we have to still think about the systems and the power at play, right? So when we think about Britain, well, people's opinions that Britain may seem like they have moved forward, but there still are the systems, there are still other things that are in place.
Do you think we haven't moved forward since 1915, this uprising?
Definitely a change, but it's just changed in a different way, right? So
are you oppressed because you're a black person in this country?
Definitely. I wouldn't use the word oppressed. I would say definitely disadvantaged in some ways, but I'm using my disadvantage to my privilege, right? For the fact that I've even been, invited to share my comments and to represent the community in which I represent, right? It's about really making sure that we have a seat at the table, that we are sharing our experiences, and that people actually listen, leading with empathy.
Very interesting conversation with her about whether or not we need to have an anti-colonialist statue in Trafalgar Square. Why are we constantly harping back to how terrible Britain was as a colonial power, instead of looking forward and celebrating how, the world is better now everywhere, nothing to do with Britain, everywhere it's better. What did you make of that conversation?
Well, let's be very simple to start with. Look, I personally believe that when the Soviet Union fell, the idea of socialist economics, socialist systems of government, socialist democracy, socialist free speech were completely discredited. The only way that these leftists now can bring in the policies that they want is to say that the only reason that Britain, America, Australia, New Zealand, all these capitalist countries, the only reason they're successful was because they made all their money from slavery. Yeah. It is a narrative that is intended to destroy this country. As far as I'm concerned, we need to stop listening to these people. What Sadiq Khan has done is very, very simple. He has changed the policy at the Greater London Authority.
You used to work there.
I used to work there. They had reserved that plinth specially for the Queen. That's why there was all these temporary statues that would go up. And so it's not a case of he's rejected the demand for the Queen's statue to be put there. He's changed the policy. And I'm getting completely sick of being told that I'm evil and everybody else is great. Let's just remind ourselves one thing about slavery. The country that not only abolished it first, but fought a war to prevent it is Britain. There are plenty of countries, and I'm sorry to say this, in Africa where slavery still exists. Get off your high horse.
Absolutely. And indeed, the only empire that actually abolished slavery, every empire before and since has done so. I couldn't agree with you more. I think people are cheering you on, but a lot of messages came on that, and I knew you were desperate to have you say so.